China does produce 32% of the world's manufacturing. I'm sure that number is going to fluctuate in the coming year and has half the per capita emissions of the US. Yet, Western media makes it a point to emphasize China's position as the world's biggest polluter, a narrative that is often used to justify unambitious climate initiatives from the global north, as we already discussed, kind of. It's hard to get a truthful view of China's position as the leader in renewable energy in the Western media, but also for myself, I would like to know. So, can you give us your assessment on the reality of the gains and how much greenwashing plays into undermining the public awareness on this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I've said for a very long time now, and this is sort of the thing that when I talk to particular audiences, I sometimes, yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to get a tomato thrown at me for saying this, but I genuinely believe that out of all the countries in the world, China is absolutely the global leader in sustainability. Again, are they perfect? I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. I'm not saying they're perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but what has happened is if we go back to 2016 and the first Trump administration, China saw a very golden opportunity to say, hey, the US just pulled out of the Paris Agreement. The US is going backwards on a lot of their environmental commitments. I think this is something China, as China, I think this is something that we can actually, take a leadership position on because they were very much looking for a way to change public perceptions from them being the world's factory to being more of a unique global service provider. So they grabbed that opportunity with both hands and they've run with it since then. There were hiccups and bumps, obviously, with the pandemic, but things have certainly kept going. So they've taken that leadership position away from the United States many, many years ago. And unless you've seen this firsthand or people tell you about this, it's, I think, for a lot of people in the West, really hard to believe that because of all the propaganda that's happened for many, many years. And one of the things that people need to understand beyond being on the same rock with everybody, like we talked about a second ago, but it's this give and take dynamic of China wouldn't need to make this stuff. The developing world wouldn't need to make this stuff if the developed world wasn't demanding this stuff. So, whose responsibility is this at the end of the day? It's kind of a microcosm of what we talked about at the beginning of the global north versus the global south. It's the industrialized consumers of the world, not necessarily just in the global north. This is happening around the world as well, anywhere there's disposable income. But the demand for products is creating a demand to create those products. So, it's this vicious cycle that we get into. But while all of that is happening, I think a lot of consumers, particularly those that are very far removed from the means of production, are not even aware that actual human beings make your stuff. And so they don't think about the impact on humans. They don't think about how their choices are impacting the pollution coming out of a factory halfway around the world. But the more people start to understand that, genuinely understand and internalize that, I think it does start to change their minds into more of a, and again, this is another loaded term that I try not to use, but turning into more of a conscious consumer, where they may not give up consumption entirely, but certainly before they make a choice, they probably think a little stronger along the lines of, okay, well, I know this is having an impact versus just buying something off the cuff and not realizing that every choice has an impact somewhere around the world.
This like leads really well into the next question, but unfortunately for me, I actually want to ask you a question to clarify what you just said. So we're gonna have to go back to that because basically what I'm really curious about too is because I've been to China several times, like first as a child, so when it just opened up, and then in the 2000s, and then last year, and the change has been really shocking in terms of the pollution. But my question is, I'm just wondering, one, what are the metrics that China uses to gauge how green, even though I know you don't like that term, but for lack of a better one,
Sure.
more sustainable, and how much of the greenwashing that I think because the West is just so sophisticated with that, like how much are they also doing in their calculations?
Yeah, so China really does, and will be very broad with this. They're looking at a few different metrics, right? So they're looking at green investment. So whether that's investment into new technologies or renewable energy, things like that. They're looking at how the production sector has either been cleaned up or the pollution levels within it or the social metrics within it. So workers' rights, worker welfare, making sure these factories are actually treating workers like they're supposed to, paying what they're supposed to, and all of those type of elements. So those are two of the big things. And then the third thing, and this is the thing that kind of behind the scenes guides everything that the party does, is what is the general public's reaction and sentiment towards us as the party, right? Because the only threat is the upheaval of the people throwing the party out of power. That's the one thing they don't want. So what can they do to make sure that people stay on side with them? And if we go back to some of the reasons why China originally wanted to turn the ship around and become more sustainable, obviously from a strategic level, they understood that's what they had to do, but there was a lot of pushback happening from people as well. I mean, I remember the time in Shanghai when I first arrived and how polluted it was all the time. There were times where you literally would go outside in the middle of winter when the factories were churning out stuff for Christmas, right? Which China doesn't even celebrate. They're churning out stuff for people in the West, and you could not see 2 feet in front of your face, right? It was so polluted. That was not also a very sustainable thing for the government to allow people to experience. So almost overnight, people started creating weather apps, creating programs so people could understand a little bit more and educate themselves on pollution and become more aware. Protests started, which I know a lot of people who have never been to China think, oh, you can't protest in China. You absolutely can protest in China, and that certainly happened. But while that's going on, there were other major incidents of things with water pollution, people getting sick. Some of the terrible stories that I remember being in Shanghai of people doing unethical things with food and making people sick or killing people. And all these things look really bad on the government. So they put a stop to those very, very quickly. To your question, though, around greenwashing, I don't think because there's such a strong focus from the people watching what Beijing is doing, I think Beijing is very reticent to be engaging in heaps of greenwashing. Is there propaganda? Of course, there's propaganda. It's China. Is there propaganda in the US? Of course, it's the United States. There's propaganda in every country that the government gives to its people. But I think by and large, they're probably staying away from veering into greenwashing as much as possible because they know the potential blowback of that if people were to find out the truth, which honestly is very easy to figure out when you're being lied to by your government if you're willing to look it up, will not look good for the party. I
Interesting
hope that
insight.
answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Really interesting insights. Thank you, John.